Everybody acts like you gotta fill out a stack of papers for every gun you touch, but that ain't the truth. There's a whole set of guns the ATF doesn't even count as firearms, and once you hear what made that list, buddy, you're gonna see the rules are a whole lot different. This is Ted from Line 45, and today, we're diving into 10 guns you can get your hands on without a background check. No FFL, no stack of forms, just straight up legal under federal law. And yeah, some of them might surprise you. Before we dive in, do me a solid. Smash that subscribe, tap the bell, hit all the dang buttons down there. You don't gotta, but it keeps this train rolling and lets me crank out more of this wild gun talk for y'all. All right, enough of that. Let's get back to it. Antique firearms, pre-1899. Here's where the myths fall apart. Under federal law, a true antique firearm, anything manufactured in or before 1898, is not a firearm for Gun Control Act purposes. That's straight out of the statute, which also covers certain replicas and muzzleloaders that either aren't designed for fixed ammunition or use cartridges that aren't made anymore and aren't readily available. Because they're outside the GCA, FFLs don't run NICS checks to transfer antiques. Feds don't treat them like modern guns in that context. A couple of things I want on your radar. First, the pre-1899 rule stands on its own. If the receiver was made in 1898 or earlier, it's an antique regardless of whether it fires a caliber you can still buy today. The replica carve-outs are separate buckets with their own conditions. Second, the NFA has its own definitions, but it also excludes antiques from the term firearm, so you're not accidentally stepping into SBR, SBS, MG territory just because something is old. Still, use common sense and verify configuration. Now the fine print. State law can be stricter. Places like Illinois run everything through the FOID framework. Some jurisdictions treat antiques more like regular guns for possession or carry, or they bolt on transport rules. Translation. Federal green light doesn't override your state's red tape. Why do shooters care? Because antiques can be bought, sold, and collected without the usual GCA hurdles, and a lot of them are perfectly shootable with modern smokeless loads or black powder substitutes if the gun is safe and properly vetted. For folks who love history but still want trigger time, this lane makes sense. And if your taste leans more toward caps, loose powder, and percussion, well, that's a whole other carve-out worth its own spotlight. Black powder guns. All right, this is where folks get tripped up. Under federal law, muzzleloaders and percussion cap revolvers that meet the antique firearm definition aren't firearms at all for Gun Control Act purposes. The statute carves out A. Anything made in or before 1898. B. Replicas not designed for rimfire, centerfire fixed ammo, or using obsolete, non-available ammo. And C. Muzzleloading rifles, shotguns, pistols designed for black powder or substitutes that cannot use fixed ammunition. If it lives in those buckets, it's outside the GCA 0, no 4473, no NICS. ATF says the same thing in plain English. A muzzleloader that meets the antique definition is not a firearm under the GCA. Even the NFA tracks that logic. The NFA's firearm definition excludes antiques, so you're not suddenly in SBR or SBS territory just because it loads from the front. Well, machine guns and destructive devices are still their own world. Two caveats I hammer home. First, state laws can be stricter. Some places treat cap and ball guns closer to modern firearms for purchase or carry, so always check your state and local rules. Second, if you take a percussion revolver and drop in a cartridge conversion cylinder, you've now created something that uses fixed ammunition. At that point, you're in firearm territory under the GCA. Don't mix up the categories. Practically, this is why you'll see cap and ball revolvers and muzzleloaders shipped to your door from big retailers, and why black powder itself sits under a different federal scheme. No federal explosives license for less than or equal to 50 pounds of commercially made BP for personal use. For folks who love history, hunt with front stuffers, or just want to sidestep the modern GCA process legally, this lane is legit, provided you play by the letter of the law where you live. 80% frames and lowers. Under today's rules, some unfinished frames, receivers, and weapon parts kits are treated like firearms, and some aren't. It depends on how ready they are. ATF's 2022 frame or receiver rule draws the line using a readily convertible test and updated definitions. So a kit or partially machined blank that can be turned into a working gun with ordinary tools may require a serial number, dealer transfer, and a background check. The Supreme Court locked that in for now. In the Bondi versus Vanderstock case, the court held that at least some parts kits and unfinished frames do fall under the Gun Control Act, meaning the usual licensing, marking, records, and checks can apply. Translation: the buy, build, shoot kits that used to ship like Lego sets are, in many cases, regulated like guns. What still flies? A true receiver blank that's solid in the fire control area and not sold as a near drop-in kit can remain outside the GCA. ATF has long said a chunk with no indexed, machined fire control cavity isn't a firearm by itself, but pair that with jigs and ready parts, and you can cross the line. ATF even issued an open letter naming certain partially complete polymer 8.0 type frames as firearms under the rule. Building for personal use is still federally lawful if you're not prohibited, and not in the business. You don't have to add a serial number just to own it. However, an FFL must mark a privately made firearm if it enters that FFL's books, such as consignment or repair. Also, it must be detectable under federal law. One more thing, state law can be tougher. Several states restrict or ban unserialized builds and parts kits outright, so check your map before you hit buy. Home-built firearms. A lot of folks don't realize this, but under federal law you can legally build your own firearm as long as it's for personal use and you're not in the business of selling or distributing it. That's been on the books for years, and it applies whether you're tinkering with a rifle kit, piecing together a shotgun, or machining from scratch. The catch is you've got to follow the same rules every manufacturer does when it comes to configuration. That means no stepping over into NFA territory unless you've already done the paperwork and paid the tax stamp. Short-barreled rifles and shotguns, machine guns, suppressors. Those require approval before you even think about cutting metal. Dimensions are non-negotiable. A rifle barrel has to be at least 16 inches, a shotgun barrel at least 18 inches, and both need a 26-inch overall length minimum. Anything shorter without that Form 1 approval is an instant NFA violation. Your gun also has to be detectable under federal law, so a solid block of polymer that sneaks past a metal detector isn't going to cut it. On top of that, Title 18, United States Code, Section 922, subsection R, restricts using too many imported parts when you're building certain semi-autos, so it's not just about slapping parts together. You've got to count what's in the mix. What's changed recently is how ATF looks at parts kits. If a kit can be readily converted into a firearm, it's treated like one, meaning background check, transfer, and serialization requirements may apply. That's where the courts have sided with ATF, so the grab-and-go kits of years past aren't quite the same today. Next up, let's get into how the law treats private sales and in-state transfers when there's no dealer in the middle. Private sales and transfer. If it's a private, in-state deal between two residents, federal law doesn't make you run a NICS check or use a gun shop, so long as you're not a prohibited person and the seller doesn't know or have reason to believe you are. That's the key. No FFL is required federally for a same-state private transfer, but it is flat-out illegal to sell to someone you suspect is prohibited under the Title 18, United States Code, Section 922, subsection D. The line you can't cross is state borders. A non-licensee can't transfer a firearm directly to a resident of another state. That has to go through an FFL under Title 18, United States Code, Section 922, subsection A5, and the parallel regulations. So, parking lot deals with out-of-state plates. Hard no. Keep it in-state if there's no dealer involved. Now, about how many can I sell? The test isn't a magic number. It's intent. After the Bipartisan Safer Communities Act, DOJ, ATF tightened the engaged in the business definition. If you're repeatedly selling to earn a profit, you're likely a dealer in the government's eyes, and you need a license. And yes, that means background checks. Hobbyist offloads from a collection is one thing. Regular profit, seeking sales are another. One more reality check. States can be stricter. A bunch of states require all private sales to run through an FFL or impose permits or waiting periods, effectively creating a universal background check at the state level. Federal law hasn't mandated that across the board, and ATF has said the recent rules didn't create universal checks for ordinary private sellers, but your state might. Know your map before you meet up. Bottom line for private, in-state swaps. Verify residency, steer clear of prohibited buyers, don't act like a dealer without a license, and follow your state's transfer rules to the letter. Inherited firearms. When a gun passes by bequest, named in a will, or intestate succession, no will, next of kin, Federal law treats that transfer differently from a normal sale. Two key carve-outs matter. 1. You can receive or bring an inherited firearm into your home state, even though you obtained it in another state. And 2. A non-licensee can transfer a firearm to an out-of-state heir to carry out the bequest, both without going through a dealer. That's straight from the Title 18, United States Code, Section 9.2.2, subsection 3, and subsection 5, which spell out the bequest, intestate exceptions. Legal to inherit still means legal for you to possess. If you're a prohibited person, or your state bars that gun, you can't take possession. The exception doesn't override disqualifications. ATF's guidance on prohibited categories and interstate transfer rules backs that up. If the estate includes NFA items, such as suppressor, SBR, MG, lawfully registered, those move to a lawful heir tax-free on ATF, Form 5, and ATF expressly allows direct interstate transfers to the beneficiary, provided the heir and their state law allow possession. If the firearm isn't going to an heir, the estate uses Form 4 tax paid. Practical tip: if an FFL is asked to handle delivery to an heir, common when shipping or for convenience, that final handoff becomes an FFL disposition, which means the heir completes a 4,473 in background check, even though federal law didn't require an FFL for the bequest itself. Some executors prefer this route for record keeping. Just know it's the dealer step, not the bequest, that triggers the check. One last wrinkle: juveniles. Federal law allows inheritance of title to a handgun by a person under 18, but not possession until a lawful exception or age is met. Plan storage accordingly to the executor. And lastly, surplus and rimfire rifles. Let's bring it home with the stuff you actually see traded every weekend: surplus bolt guns and rimfire workhorses. Most surplus rifles, think Mosin, Nagants, Mausers, SKS variants, qualify as curio and relic because they're 50-plus years old. But here's the key: C and R are still firearms under the Gun Control Act, not antiques. That means they're treated like modern guns, unless you're using a collector's FFL or going through a dealer. Where the no FFL talk shows up is in same-state private sales. Federal law allows an unlicensed person to sell a firearm to another unlicensed resident of the same state, so long as the seller doesn't know, or have reason to believe, the buyer is prohibited. That's the lane where a garage sale Mosin, a gun show SKS, or a buddy's Ruger 10-20 seconds can change hands without a dealer. ATF's own guidance spells it out and reminds you that state law may add extra hoops. Cross a state line and the rule flips. A non-licensee may not transfer a firearm directly to an out-of-state resident. That deal has to run through an FFL in the recipient state. No, meet me at the border shortcuts. Two more realities. First, this isn't universal background checks. ATF is clear that the recent federal rules didn't mandate checks for ordinary intrastate private sales by people who aren't engaged in the business. Second, some states are stricter and require private transfers to go through a dealer or use permits. If your state says FFL only, that overrides the federal baseline for in-state swaps. To sum it up, C and R Mauser or a rimfire like the 10-20 seconds can be traded face-to-face in-state under federal law. Just vet residency, avoid prohibited buyers, and know your state's rules before cash and steel change hands.